Agnieszka. As you said, it is also my greatest honor and pleasure to introduce to you our today's distinguished guest, Professor Jemina Napier from Edinburgh, Scotland. Professor Napier is a leading researcher in the field of sign language interpreting studies. Currently, she is affiliated with Heriot-Watt University, UK, as Chair of Intercultural Communication and Associate Principal for Research, Culture and People. But she's also a visiting professor at the Centre for Deaf Studies at Trinity College Dublin and corresponding fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. For many years, she was also connected with Macquarie University in Sydney, where she established a master's program in Auslan English interpreting. She is the author of over 150 publications on sign language interpreting, a manager of many research projects based in the UK, Australia, and all over Europe, a member of various editorial or advisory boards of journals and book series, research-related boards, and national and international organizations of sign language interpreters. Despite the multitude of her academic and didactic commitments, she has never ceased practicing sign language interpreting, her working languages being English, British Sign Language, Australian Sign Language, and International Sign. Professor Napier's research interests revolve, among others, around communication and interpreting, particularly, but not only, in the context of sign languages, deaf community issues, non-professional interpreting called language brokering, the processes of translanguaging between spoken, signed, and written languages, interpreting pedagogy, research methodologies, and more recently, gender and health-related issues within the field of sign language interpreting. For many, many years, she has been campaigning for closer collaboration between spoken and sign language interpreting researchers. Professor Napier is a heritage signer from a multi-generational deaf family, a most accomplished scholar, an absolute trendsetter in the field of sign language interpreting research, and my academic guru. So, Professor Napier, your lecture for the Institute of Applied Linguistics today is my dream coming true. It is with pure delight and excitement that I'm saying those words. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for such a warm introduction. I always feel slightly embarrassed when people give these kinds of introductions. I feel like I should look over my shoulder and wonder who they're talking about, because I realise they're talking about me. So thank you. I appreciate the lovely introduction, and I hope that my presentation holds up to my guru status for you. I'd also like to thank everybody for the invitation to speak today for this 50-year anniversary event. It's a wonderful opportunity to give this presentation to fellow interpreters and translators and students and researchers in Poland. I wish I could be there in person, but that wasn't possible this time. But perhaps another time I'll be able to come and visit and meet some of you in person. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the work of all the interpreters that are working today. So the interpreters who are working between English and Polish, and also those working from Polish to Polish Sign Language. As Alexandra said, I'm still a working interpreter myself, a practicing interpreter myself. Not very much these days. I don't have a lot of time because of my research and teaching commitments, but I think it's really critical that I continue as a practitioner, as an interpreter, because my interpreting practice feeds into my teaching and my research, and my teaching, I think, also helps maintain and enhance my practice as an interpreter. And I think it's really critical that anybody who's involved in research has, if they don't have interpreting experience themselves, that they work closely with practicing interpreters so that we can really ensure that our research has impact and makes a difference, to interpreters' practice, but ultimately then to the quality of life for deaf people. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully you will all be able to see it once I do that. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yes, it's all right. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks. So you'll see the title of my presentation today is an overview of the transformation of sign language interpreting as profession and research, and sign language interpreting studies as a transformative field. Now, it's quite a long title, and I will break that down into different components and explain what I mean by this title. But I was asked to talk about sign language interpreting as a profession, and as also the emergence of sign language interpreting research over time, to reflect on where we've come from and also perhaps where we're going in the future. So this is an idea I have been talking about for a couple of years now, about how we can make transformations through our research in sign language interpreting. So to give you an overview of what I'm going to touch on today, I'll start first of all by just defining what I mean by transformative research, so everyone has a clear idea of what I mean by that. Then I will talk a bit about interpreting studies generally, for both spoken and sign language interpreting studies. And then I'll go on to situate, if you like, sign language interpreting studies within the broader discipline of interpreting studies, and how sign language interpreting studies can be transformative. And then towards the end, I'll talk a bit about my own personal research journey and how I feel it's been transformed over time, but also how I feel my research has been transformative, so how it's made an impact and affected change through the evidence that we were able to curate through research. I'm going to take the pace quite slowly today to allow for all the interpretation. So I'm going to keep my eye on the Polish Sign Language interpreter. When I see they finish the slot, then I'll go on to the next slide. So to start by talking about what is transformative research. I'm happy to make these slides available afterwards. They're all in English, obviously, but if people would like a copy afterwards, I'm happy to share them. So when we think about transformative research, basically this means that the research generates new ideas or discoveries that really change quite radically our understanding of something, the way something works, or an existing concept or an existing practice, which can then create a shift in the way that we think about things or the way that we do things. So when we think about research work being transformative, it's a transformative paradigm really centers marginalized communities. So this is why I think this is a good fit for us when we're thinking about sign language interpreting and deaf communities, because we know that deaf people are minoritized, they are often discriminated, oppressed, so they're marginalized community. And so transformative research is supposed to produce these ideas and these discoveries that will affect change, will have an impact to create a new way of thinking or a new way of doing things or a new understanding. So we can do research on sign language interpreting that can really affect change for deaf people who use sign language on a daily basis. And a big part of transformative research requires us to think about power differentials and how we can really empower marginalized communities, so in our case, deaf communities, through the research that we do to try and affect social change. And we have to be particularly conscious that the majority of sign language interpreters are hearing. So we are members of the majority community. And so and we're working with deaf people as members of a marginalized community and doing research with deaf people as a marginalized community. So there's an inherent power dynamic in the work that we do as interpreters and also as researchers. And transformative research often will push boundaries, so it doesn't always fit nicely, neatly with existing theories or existing models. We can push boundaries and push the way that we think about things. And sometimes transformative research might not be recognized for many years later. So somebody might do research and make suggestions for new ideas, and then the real impact of those new ideas might not be recognized until much later, because change can be slow, a slow process. And I'll give you some examples of that a little bit later on. Essentially, any transformative research really can redefine the boundaries of research and really help us to get new insights, perhaps unexpected insights into new technologies, new methods, new ways of doing things, and so on. So that's kind of the paradigm. That's the overall idea of what I mean by transformative research. So we have seen, so I've talked about transformative research. Now let's talk about sign language interpreting. We have seen a transformation. So in this context, when I say transformation, I mean change. So something that's transformative can lead to change. Whereas with sign language interpreting, we know that it has changed. There's been a huge transformation in the profession over many years. And so we know that we could consider these questions, for example, like how has the profession evolved? How has it changed? How has the field of interpreting studies matured, or sign language interpreting studies? What are the research paradigm shifts? So how do people do research on sign language interpreting? And how has it changed our thinking? So how has it been transformative? So before I go on to talk a bit more about sign language interpreting studies, I'd like to situate interpreting studies more generally. I know if within the Institute of Applied Linguistics, you'll have people doing research on language, communication, translation, spoken language interpreting, and also some sign language interpreting. So I think it's important to think about that wider context. And I'm focusing on interpreting studies, and which also is situated within the broader discipline of translation studies, or some would argue alongside it, so translation studies, interpreting studies. So let's have a look at what we can say about that broad interpreting studies discipline. So we know that interpreting has been professionalized in the 20th century. For spoken language interpreters, really the profession developed through conference interpreting, the establishment of conference interpreting in the 1950s, and was very quickly regarded as quite a high status profession because of the nature of the training that was required, working simultaneously with equipment, interpreting in very challenging situations. So we know that, for example, with the post-World War II war crimes tribunals and other war crimes tribunals that have taken place since then. So conference interpreters have very clear working conditions, guidelines, pay structures, requirements for training, and is probably a lot more well established. Community interpreting really didn't emerge or begin to be recognized as a profession until the 1980s or 1990s. And we know that in many countries, those who work in the community or in public service as public service interpreters are still struggling for recognition. So they're often we're still seen as carers or helpers, and therefore we have somewhat of a lower status than conference interpreters. And interestingly, sign language interpreting, we kind of almost started the other way around. So sign language interpreters began work in the community first. Typically, people talk about interpreters working, in medical appointments, in court, legal appointments, in schools with deaf children, as deaf schools began to close down. So working a lot more in the community or in public services. And in the last perhaps 10 or 20 years, we've seen a lot more demand for sign language interpreting in conference settings, because more deaf people are now able to go to university, achieve qualifications, which means they can get professional roles, which means that they want to attend conferences as part of their work. And even though sign language interpreters have been working at conferences in the deaf sector for some time, so for example, the World Federation of the Deaf Congress has had interpreters working for many, many, many years, but we're seeing more demand for sign language interpreters to work in conferences outside of the deaf sector, so not in specialist deaf conferences, but in other broader conferences. And we also see a big demand for interpreters now at the UN, in Geneva and New York, also in the EU Parliament, for events that are live streamed. So there's a lot more visibility now for sign language interpreters alongside spoken language interpreters. Just moving the next slide across. So as I was just saying, that the sign language interpreting has really evolved from the community. Our roots are really in the deaf community. There is various people have written about the fact that interpreters often would initially start their work because deaf people would recognize their skills or their attitude, their aptitude, that they had what they would like to see in interpreters, and they would encourage them and say, oh, come, you can interpret for me, you should come with me, and they would encourage them and support them. And sign language interpreting researchers and practitioners have really trailblazed, if you like, have led the way in thinking about what the role of an interpreter is. And I think this has come from the fact that with spoken language interpreting first really developing as a profession in conference settings, so interpreters being in a booth far away from the delegates, not having any direct contact with the delegates. And so this notion of the interpreter as a conduit or the interpreter as invisible was also borrowed into sign language interpreting when we first began to professionalize. But it was not long until people realized that that model of the interpreter role doesn't work for sign language interpreters. We are very visible in the work that we do because we're in the room with people, whether it's in a public service setting or in a conference, we're still visible. We're very present. And so early researchers in sign language interpreting really started to push the boundaries. So this is where the transformative research comes in. They started to push the boundaries and ask questions about what the role of an interpreter is very early on. And our roots in the community really come from the fact that we have very close engagement with deaf communities. And now we're seeing more and more deaf scholars wanting to be involved in doing research on interpreting, to bring deaf eyes, if you like, on interpreting practices, so that we are seeing from both perspectives. So moving on to talk a little bit more about interpreting research. Again, when we look back to what sort of the emergence of interpreting research publications, we started to see publications emerge in the 1950s, but these tended to be based on personal observations. So conference interpreters talking about their experiences, and many people will probably be familiar with the book that was written by Danica Seleskovich, who was a very well-known conference interpreter in France. And she talked about making meaning, making sense when you're interpreting and not focusing word for word. And she was one of the first people to talk about this idea, this transformative idea, but it wasn't based on empirical research, on evidence. It was based on her experiences as an interpreter, very experienced interpreter. So for some time, most of the writings we saw were based on experienced practitioners, interpreters talking about their suggestions for what worked for them as interpreters. And it was really in the 1980s that we saw much more research being published, which was based on empirical evidence. So actually data being collected and analysed to create a body of evidence to talk about how interpreting works, what can we learn about the way that interpreting works. And in the last 20 years, I would say, since I finished my PhD just over 20 years ago, and in the last 20 years, can confidently say we have seen a huge growth in the number of publications on interpreting studies, on research on interpreting, and that's partially because we've seen a lot more translation and interpreting specific journals being established. There are many more journals that we can publish in now. Some of them are very good. A lot of them are very good journals that publish very high quality work. So there are much more ways now that we can promote our research, and we can publicize our research, publish our research, and people still publish in applied linguistics journals and other journals related to language and communication. But we have a big body of specific interpreting and translation journals now to publish in, which has helped. Interestingly, when we look at the profile of interpreting studies researchers, initially those researchers in the 1980s and 1990s were actually researchers in other institutions, other disciplines, focusing on translation and interpreting themes. So perhaps psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, linguists, and often they would look at translation or interpreting processes really to understand language and communication. So for example, psychologists might look at the work of a simultaneous conference interpreter to try and better understand bilingual processing, so how your brain works when you're moving between two languages. So initially, a large body of work was really using interpreters as subjects to investigate and understand language, communication, bilingualism, language in the brain, that kind of thing. Over time, we've seen more people who perhaps have been in languages departments. So they might have been specialists in French, German, Polish, Spanish, starting to do research on translation and interpreting, perhaps because they are teaching interpreters in courses, in programs they have in their language department, and then they have the opportunity to conduct research. But now we're actually seeing more and more departments which are specifically focused around translation and interpreting studies. So that's in their title, and when people work there, they teach translation and interpreting specifically, but they also do research in translation and interpreting. And that's their goal. So they're not a researcher in another discipline that's sort of drawing on interpreting in order to inform their research agenda. Their focus is on interpreting. So it's not just looking at examining interpreting for the sake of understanding language. It's actually examining interpreting for the sake of understanding interpreting. So as I was saying, originally the research was to inform other disciplines and language processing. Now the purpose of interpreting is to really understand more about interpreting. What is it that we do well? How do we do it? What decisions do interpreters make and why? But also more broadly, what the impact is on the people who are relying on interpretation to happen or working with interpreters. So interpreting studies has evolved as a multidisciplinary field or transdisciplinary field, an interdisciplinary field. So we have people that come from very different backgrounds, linguists, psychologists, sociologists, and quite often they will apply theoretical frameworks or research methods from their discipline specific background to the study of interpreting and how we understand interpreting. And these are the three primary disciplines: psychology, linguistics, and sociology. So I'm a trained linguist. My PhD was in linguistics, and I'll tell you a bit more about my own research profile a bit later. But one of the good things about this transition of interpreting research is that we are seeing more practitioners, so interpreters who work as research, interpreters who work, becoming researchers. And Daniel Gilles has used this term practice searchers, practitioner, researcher, which is combined into one word. And we are seeing more and more publications about how to do research on interpreting, and quite often that features research from practice searchers, from people who are like myself, who do interpreting and also do research on interpreting. These are just some examples of books that have been published about how to do research on interpreting. So it's interesting, we're also seeing another shift, not just the fact that we're seeing more research on interpreting to understand more interpreting, about interpreting, but we're also seeing more publications which explain the most effective ways to do research on interpreting from different methodological perspectives, from different disciplines, different paradigms. And so these are just some suggestions. I've written one book called Research Methods and Interpreting with Sandra Hale, who's a very well-known researcher who looks at legal interpreting, mostly court and police interpreting. So we co-wrote one book, kind of like a guidebook, if you like, for anyone who wants to do research on interpreting. And so these are some other suggestions as well. And I love this quote from a colleague of mine, Jens Hessmann, who's German. And he says that all interpreting researchers should be as nosy and as noisy or visible as possible, encouraging anyone to be involved in the interpreting business to inquire more deeply into the trade and share their findings with others. And so this really is this idea of encouraging practice searchers, that people who do interpreting can also be involved in doing research on interpreting, or examining what we do as interpreters so that we can better understand it, and then we can teach it and apply it in our practice. So let's look then at the transformation of sign language interpreting studies in that wider context of interpreting studies. So we know there's been a shift in interpreting studies generally. So let's have a closer look at sign language interpreting studies and where we've seen the shifts happening. Interestingly for us, quite often researchers were initially in special education departments or in deaf studies departments, because they were involved in maybe deaf education programs, and sign language interpreting was seen as a sideline. It was something that people perhaps were interested in, but it wasn't their core business in the university that they were in. Deaf studies departments began to be established, and deaf studies is seen as that much broader overview of studying the lives of deaf people, the lives and communication preferences of deaf people. And again, sign language interpreting is one stream of that, one theme, if you like, within deaf studies. Similarly with interpreting studies generally, sign language interpreting studies became more visible in languages departments, in linguistics departments, where people, perhaps they might have been teaching sign language interpreting or working just in a linguistics department and took interest in sign languages and therefore interpreting as a sideline. But we're also seeing more sign language interpreting researchers and educators now in translation and interpreting studies departments. So for example, the department that I'm in at Heriot-Watt University is called the Department of Languages and Intercultural Studies. And we have several programs that train spoken language interpreters in conference and public service interpreting. We also have programs in business communication. We have a specific British Sign Language interpreting program at undergraduate level, and we also have a postgraduate program which focuses on international sign. But we also have one program which offers students the opportunity to study BSL, British Sign Language, with and English with one other spoken language. So they can also do German, French, or Spanish. And our program is one of the few in the world, there are not many, where sign language interpreters can also study another spoken language. So we have seen a transition in where we see sign language interpreting studies happening in which departments. And I used this picture to talk about a mini explosion of sign language interpreting research. And this was in 2007. I went to the conference of the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters, and I had reviewed how many publications there had been. And I'd cited the work of a woman called Nadia Grubich in Austria, who she had actually reviewed how many publications there had been from the early 1980s, 1990s, up until her article was published in, I think it was in 2002 or 2004. And she had found that there were approximately 200 publications on sign language interpreting, based on sign language interpreting research. And that included some dissertations, a few journal articles, some book chapters, a few books, but approximately 200 over a period of about 25 years. I did then a very quick analysis of how many publications there had been since her article in 2002 to the Conference of the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters in 2007. This was the very first WASLI conference. And there had been approximately 200 publications in that very short period of time. I think it was not quite 200, it was over 100. And so I felt like there had been this mini explosion, because in the 20 or 30 year period, there had been 200 publications. And then in a 5-year period, there had been almost another 200. So we can just see this explosion happening with sign language interpreting research, and research being undertaken by more people in more disciplines on a range of different topics. So I'm going to go through with you now some sort of key paradigms, research approaches to the study of interpreting, and give you some examples. So researchers that have really come from a very linguistic background, taking a strong linguistic approach, have tended to look at aspects of language use in interpreting, and different linguistic aspects of interpreting decisions that are made and linguistic output. So, for example, analysis of finger spelling, the use of finger spelling, analysis of accuracy, analysis of whether interpreters make omissions. I did that for my PhD. I looked at what kinds of omissions interpreters made and why, use of pausing, and so on. So linguists tend to want to look at the output and whether it makes sense, and what linguistic strategies interpreters use. Psycholinguists, as I mentioned earlier on, are quite often they're very interested in aspects of cognition. So they'll look at things like working memory. They're interested in bilingualism and bimodalism if they're looking at sign language interpreting. So how interpreters are working between two modalities. Perhaps memory issues, how interpreters remember names, numbers. There have also been studies which I've been involved in around aptitude and personality of interpreters. So is there a typical profile of sign language interpreters? Interestingly, one study I did with one of my former PhD students, we asked sign language interpreters to rate their personality traits. And what we found was that interpreters tend to be very open to change, willing to take risks, quite emotionally stable, and slightly more on the extrovert scale than the introvert scale. And if anyone's interested, I could send you a reference for that. So you can see that there is a body of work that looks at sign language interpreting from this perspective, so sort of a more psychological or psycholinguistic perspective. This is my favorite. So I came from a linguistic background, and I have moved into a more of a sociolinguistic, applied linguistic approach to the analysis of interpreting. So sociolinguists tend to look at interpreting in interaction. So what are the sociolinguistic factors that impact on an interpreter's work? So looking at turn taking, how they manage communication, the use of pausing in order to manage interaction, how interpreters interrupt to clarify or to repair what they're doing, and really look at interpreting as a co-constructed event, that interpreters are participants, and that they are working as a team, either with other interpreters, but also with the deaf and hearing people who they're interacting with, who they're mediating the interaction for. And some of you might be aware of the work of Cynthia Roy. Her work was very seminal, extremely seminal in our field. She did a case study of one deaf PhD student talking to his PhD supervisor, his professor, and did a very fine-grained discourse analysis of every single turn exchange in that interaction between the interpreter, the professor, the hearing professor, and the deaf PhD student. And she looked at how the interpreter managed the communication, when they used pausing, how they used pausing, and how the interpreter really mediated the communication and co-constructed the whole interaction with the deaf and hearing person. And Cecilia Vardenscher has done similar work with spoken language interpreting. So the two of them were publishing at about the same time and were talking to each other, and really their research has had a major impact on our understanding of the role of the interpreter and the way that we work as interpreters from a sociolinguistic perspective. My initial background was actually in sociology. So my first degree was in sociology. So I've also done a lot of research exploring interpreting from a sociological perspective. And there are other researchers that have done various types of studies examining perceptions of interpreters and interpreting. So how effective it is, what the challenges are, what works well, what works not so well, and from the perspective of deaf people, but also from hearing people, perhaps, that can't sign and regularly work with interpreters. Also with interpreters themselves about their own perspectives on their work and where they work. And increasingly, more recently, we're seeing more work that adopts a sociological approach to examining power dynamics, ethical practices, and one of the most current topics is around whether sign language interpreting is effectively a social institution. And I have co-edited a special issue of a journal with Marcia de Mulder and Hilda Howland. So I'll give the signs to the interpreter, I don't know if they can see me, Marcia and Hilda. So we've co-edited a journal issue which focuses on discussion of sign language interpreting as a social institution. So how you might be familiar with discussions around the fact that if you bring in a sign language interpreter, it can create an illusion of inclusion. So just because a sign language interpreter is available doesn't mean that it's inclusive. An inclusive environment doesn't mean the deaf people have access. Sometimes it can be seen as a band-aid solution. And if sign language interpreting provision is always seen only through the lens of access, are we perpetuating actually the lack of access and lack of equity for deaf people? So it's trying to unpack some of these ideas around where the sign language interpreting is becoming an institution in itself. So this is really adopting a very sociological perspective on sign language interpreting as a profession. But we're still in the very early stages of research with sign language interpreting if you compare with other disciplines. We still have a long way to go. There's still so much more that we could do research on. There's still so much more knowledge that we could create, more boundaries that we can push with our understanding about interpreting. And I'm citing the work of two other researchers, Lorraine Leeson and Miriam Vermeerbergen from Belgium, and Lorraine is from Ireland. And they talk about there being 3 stages in sign language interpreting research. The first is what they call Generation Zero research, which is the same as with interpreting studies generally. It's very descriptive and prescriptive work. So people publishing based much more on their personal narratives. Then moving into first generation research, so more theoretical considerations and analyses. And then second generation research, where you can examine what students do, what professionals do, based on the knowledge that you've gleaned through the first generation research. And I would say now, I think we're moving more into second generation research. But we still have a lot more first generation research to do. So we still have lots of research that's needed around sign language interpreting, more theoretical considerations, more analyses of interpreting work. But now, because we do have a body of understanding about how sign language interpreting works, we're able to see more pedagogical research happening. How do we teach this to students? How do we assess students? How do students, when they graduate, develop their skills to become more seasoned practitioners? So we are seeing more of a shift, but there's still a huge amount of work for us to do, plenty of work for us all to do. And as I said earlier on in my introduction, I think it's very important for me to maintain my skills as a practitioner, because it feeds into my teaching, which feeds into my research, which feeds back into my practice and back into teaching. So it's very circular. And we see this in sign language interpreting specifically. We see a lot of researchers are still practicing interpreters themselves. And a lot of the leading researchers, I would say, are also very well known and very skilled interpreters in their own right, and are recognised as such in their own countries. So now I've given you an overview of the transformation of sign language interpreting studies as a research discipline. Let's consider then what potential transformative impact of sign language interpreting studies or sign language interpreting research has been, and where it has the potential to be transformative in making an impact in people's lives. We've seen, obviously, with the establishment of the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters in 2007, we now have more national and international standards. Research has provided evidence to support the development of interpreter qualifications, accreditations, standards for assessments. We now have an international sign interpreter accreditation system, which is a worldwide system. And we're seeing that sign language interpreting is still emerging as a profession in many, many countries. So a lot of the information I've shared with you today has come from a very Western, global North perspective, because we know that if we look at the global South, there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of establishing profession and also conducting research. But they're certainly a lot further now than they were a few years ago. I've just finished co-editing a book, which is an update of a book I edited in 2000, which was published in 2009, which was called International Perspectives on Sign Language Interpreter Education. And that book gave an overview of different approaches to training sign language interpreters in different countries throughout the world. So we've just done an update of that volume, and I brought in two other co-editors, a hearing and a deaf colleague, to work with me. And we've also approached many more different countries to try and have a broader picture of sign language interpreter and translator training and education in different countries throughout the world. And we've included more countries from the global South, because there's a lot more information to share now about what's happening in these countries. So I want to share with you some comments that have been made to me from different people about how sign language interpreting research has been transformative for them, how it's made a difference to them in their lives. So this is a hearing expert interpreter and mentor, so someone who's very experienced as an interpreter. And they said that not only is there more information about the deaf community's language and culture, but there is increased awareness of interpreting, what it means to be a professional interpreter, and expectations about how we engage interpreters. So this person who had begun interpreting before there was really any training in her country, before there was any research, really felt the positive impact of research. This is a quote from a hearing novice interpreter, so from a newly qualified interpreter, who said, as a new interpreter, I have found the research into sign language interpreting beneficial for the simple reason that it allows me to understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing specific things when I'm working. So from reading other people's research, I've been able to have a stronger understanding of what interpreting really is. What are the processes of interpreting? What are the best ways to cope with uncomfortable situations, and how to work in different settings, and how to work with the deaf community and other interpreters and professionals. This is a quote from a deaf interpreter who said that the research has raised the profile of interpreting and added appealing elements to the profession, makes it more of a profession than just a job to pay the bills. So it changes the perceptions of the profession by providing evidence, but changes the deaf community's expectations too of what they can expect from interpreters. I also asked some deaf people themselves who are not involved in interpreting or in teaching interpreters or in doing research on interpreting, just regular deaf people who work with interpreters on a regular basis, either through work or when they go to the doctor or hospital or whatever. And this is one quote from a deaf professional who says that they regularly use interpreters, and the growing field of sign language interpreting research has given them much greater appreciation of the skills and strategies that interpreters bring to their work and how we can support each other to achieve better outcomes. And much of the research involves collaboration with deaf consumers, deaf people themselves, and interpreters. So it's given us more opportunities to reflect on our language shifts, and I look forward to seeing more of this exciting research. This is a quote from an interpreter educator, so someone who's been involved in training interpreters for some time. And they say, I cannot overstate the value and importance of interpreting research. Research and publications about interpreting aid in our understanding of what we do when we interpret, and can provide insights into the multitude of skills that an interpreter must possess for budding practitioners and broader community interpreters alike. This understanding then informs both the content of courses and the pedagogy that we use to teach new interpreters. And finally, a quote from service providers, so people who run agencies for providing interpreters. One says, research can assist service providers to more forcefully lobby government for improved services. Proving and demonstrating need is always required before any funding body will commit funds to a programme. So there should continue to be a very direct connection between research and development of sign language interpreting and the end product delivered by service providers to deaf people. And another service provider said that they had actually restructured their internal operations and policies and employment conditions because of the research evidence. So we can see different perspectives from deaf people, from interpreters themselves, from interpreter educators, from service providers on why sign language interpreting research is valuable, how it can be transformative, how it can make an impact on deaf people's lives, but also on the quality of interpreting. And so we have seen paradigm shifts. We've seen shifts in the nature of the research that's been done, from more sort of psycholinguistic perspectives to more sociolinguistic understandings of interaction, as I mentioned earlier, which have shaped our understanding of the interpreter role and have enabled us to advance interpreting theory as well, because theoretical shifts are also important, not just practical shifts. So I think that there has been some transformative thinking that's happened in sign language interpreting studies. Now, if you remember back to my earlier definition, where I talked about transformative research pushing boundaries, creating new ideas, perhaps challenging existing ideas, being more centered on marginalized communities. So if we consider sign language interpreting, I think that we're now seeing research that looks at the ontological insecurity of people who access information through interpreters. And by that, I mean how people's belief systems are influenced by the way they work with interpreters, and how it might, it impacts on their well-being and their feelings of safety and confidence. People's knowledge and understanding of interpreters and interpreting, the epistemological perceptions, where now we often talk about working with interpreters, not using interpreters. So this has been a big shift that we've seen in our discourse, really because of research. We now have much more open discussions about the visibility of sign language interpreters, and changing our understanding of the role of interpreters and impartiality and neutrality. And also going beyond what we think about interpreting accuracy. So we're not just talking about, does the interpreter reflect what person A says to person B, not just what they say, but now we're starting to focus more on how they say it. Can interpreters represent deaf people and hearing people in terms of their personality and their style? And so it's not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it, and thinking about how we can match accordingly. So these kinds of ideas are quite transformative, and they've moved us a long way from our thinking in sign language interpreting 20 or 30 years ago. So I'm going to start wrapping up now, but I'll just take you through the quick sort of personal research journey that I've been on, and how I feel my research has been transformed over time, and how I feel some of my research has been transformative in how it's impacted on the lives of interpreters and deaf people. So this is a sort of like a snapshot of who I am. I started out as a sociologist. My first degree was in sociology, and I worked as a sign language interpreter before in the UK, before there was any official training available. As Alexandra said in the introduction, I grew up as a heritage signer. My parents are deaf. Actually, there were 4 generations of deafness in my family. So my first language was British Sign Language. So I began working as an interpreter right at the beginning of the establishment of the profession in the UK. And through my studies, I studied interpreting later on when there was a master's degree available. I then did a PhD in linguistics, and I've moved now more into sociolinguistics and applied linguistics in interpreting studies. And because of my background, this has really influenced the nature of the research that I have done, and the approaches that I take to doing research, the sort of the paradigm and the theoretical frameworks that I follow, the methods that I use. So as a sociologist and then an interpreter, I was able to kind of re-identify research ideas or research questions quite often through my own practice as an interpreter, but also through what I observed in other interpreters, or that stakeholders had informed me, or when I was teaching. So quite often my initial research questions were very practical. Then as a linguist, and then later a sociolinguist and an applied linguist, I became more interested in looking at interpreting in interaction, and actually looking more closely at the way that we talk about interpreting, the way that we do interpreting, how we manage the interpreting process, and so have taken a much more linguistic approach to analysis of interpreting. But I tend to move between sociological and applied or sociolinguistic approaches to the analysis of interpreting. And I've done research using linguistic and sociological studies and sociolinguistic studies in different institutional settings. So I've looked at how interpreting works in legal settings. For example, whether deaf people can serve as jurors in adversarial courtrooms, how effective it is to use video link or audio video link, so video remote interpreting in court. I've done analysis on interpreting interactions in police settings, in police interviews using authentic data. And most recently, I've been exploring best practices for interpreting with victims of domestic abuse. I've also done research in the educational institutional setting. So my original PhD was looking at omissions of the interpreters made and their decision-making in university lectures. I've also looked at academic lectures and compared deaf people presenting lecturers with interpreters interpreting for lectures, and the kind of language contact and how they use finger spelling and mouthing. And also I've looked at classroom interactions and how interpreters manage like question and answer sessions between teachers and students. The research that I've done in healthcare settings has looked at things like how we establish and develop and agree and decide on new medical terminology in sign language, access to healthcare information. So not just if you have an interpreter with the doctor, but how you access information if you're diagnosed with an illness and you need ongoing treatment. The role of healthcare interpreters, and at the moment I'm involved in a project that looks at interpreting for Mental Health Act assessments, which here in the UK is very specific to if a person has been diagnosed with a mental illness and they're no longer deemed to be safe, either themselves or there's a concern about their own safety or whether they might cause injury to other people, then they have to be assessed through the Mental Health Act, which is a legal act, which means they might be incarcerated, they might be taken into hospital or treatment. And it's not voluntary because they're so ill, mentally ill. So we're doing a project at the moment, which is for both spoken and sign language interpreters together, looking at how interpreters can best work with mental health professionals in that context. I've also examined, interpreter swap. I've also examined how deaf people and interpreters can work together in the workplace. So how deaf people can advance at work by working more closely with interpreters, and how deaf people can give presentations by collaborating closely with interpreters, and thinking about interpreting and identity work and how, as I mentioned earlier about representation, how interpreters can represent deaf professionals at work. I've also done research in the arena of politics, so looking at how deaf leaders work with interpreters, how they report their experiences of working with interpreters. Again, some more work around video remote interpreting in European institutions and how people can contact their MEPs, their members of the European Parliament. And I've done some substantial work on international sign conference interpreting, primarily in political arenas, so in institutional settings like the EU, Parliament and the UN. But now I'm moving into new directions. So up until now, my research has always focused on professional interpreting, and so how professional interpreters mediate communication between deaf and hearing people in these different institutional contexts. But now my research interests are broadening. So I'm looking to adopt more ethnography in my work and more observations over a period of time, rather than using just simulations, trying to use authentic data, access authentic data as much as I can to see how interpreting or mediation of communication functions in real life contexts. So this is an example of the use of linguistic ethnography, so combining various research methodologies to study interpreting. So we're using surveys, observations of interpreted phone calls, interviews, focus groups, discourse analysis, of interpreting data, in order to really develop a much more holistic picture of how interpreting happens. And this was a European Parliament context in one of our projects. I'm also being more influenced, I think, by through different theoretical transformations. So drawing on researchers, authors, theorists in applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, social philosophy, to really influence my work and frame my work more theoretically. And also trying out new methods too. So historically, I've often used interviews and focus groups from a sociological perspective to get people's perceptions. I've done linguistic analyses, applied linguistic analyses, discourse analyses of interpreted data, but I'm trying to use more innovative methods, so visual methods, using photographs, vignettes, artwork, yeah, like I said earlier, ethnography, observing what happens in practice to really try and explore interpreting through different perspectives. So I think on my research journey, I have transformed. I've become more mature as a researcher. I think I started out as a more independent researcher with my PhD. A lot of my early publications were on my own. Whereas now I'm a much more collaborative researcher. I work very closely with a lot of deaf and hearing scholars. And I also do a lot more interdisciplinary work. So I collaborate with people who are not in interpreting studies, but perhaps in legal studies or social work or mental health work, to try and bring different interdisciplinary perspectives on our work. So I've definitely been through different phases, and I would say have moved through different disciplines in my research journey. So has my research been transformative? I would say yes, because my research has always been focused on deaf signers. So I've done a lot of research on interpreters and interpreting, but in pretty much every single study I have ever done, I always include the perspective of deaf people. And I always, wherever possible, work collaboratively with deaf researchers. I think that my research has been transformative in understanding that we need to consider the perspectives of all three interlocutors, so deaf people, hearing people, and interpreters themselves, to really understand the interpreting process. And some of my research has definitely affected social change. So we've seen, for example, my research on whether deaf people can serve on juries in several countries has led to law reform. So in countries like the UK, Australia, and Ireland, where people are selected to serve on a jury in criminal trials. So lay people have to serve on juries, and it's a social obligation, a civic duty. And previously, deaf people in these countries were not permitted to serve on juries because they were deaf. And our research demonstrated that there was no disadvantage, that there was no reason why they couldn't participate with interpreters. So now 2 states in Australia, also the UK government and the Irish government have all changed the law to allow deaf people to serve as jurors. So just to wrap up, I think one of the key things as well to emphasise about doing transformative research is that we need to be transparent and accountable. We need to ensure that we're doing ethical research. So it's about being respectful of the communities that we work with, especially marginalised communities, recognising their strength and resilience, providing reciprocity to community members, not just taking from them so that we can understand, do our research on interpreting, but working as much as possible collaboratively with them and being transparent about what we do. And so I think that this, for me, is a strong ethos in my own research. So it's crucial for us, for practice searchers, for researchers, to define our stance, not only within the research, but within the community, so people understand who we are, what we're doing, why we're doing it, so that the results of our research is not only meaningful to us as researchers, but also to the researched. So the people who are in the community being involved in the research, whether that's deaf people or interpreters. As I mentioned, I'm extending my research interest now, so I'm looking into other areas of non-professional communication, so sign language brokering, family language policy in deaf hearing families, and also sort of a continuum of mediated communication. So when do deaf people kind of agree to communicate directly, as opposed to deciding when to bring in an interpreter? I'm interested in what that continuum is, and where communication becomes mediated and who decides on that mediation. So that's it from me. I hope that this has been an interesting journey for you to think about how sign language interpreting has been transformed as a profession, but also as a research discipline, but also how sign language interpreting studies can be transformative in effecting change, making a difference to people's lives. I'd like to acknowledge two of my deaf colleagues, Annelies Kusters and Marta de Mulder, who have given presentations on transformations in deaf studies, which really inspired me for this presentation to thinking about how sign language interpreting studies can also be transformed and transformative. And that's all from me. So I think we have some time for questions or comments before we sign off for the day. And thanks again to all the interpreters for keeping up with me.